Welcome to Americana Archives. Today's headline is The Career of a Ranger. The subheadline says, Some Leads from the Adventurous Life of Comanche George. This article originally came from the New York Sun. It says, Comanche George, the genuine discoverer of the marvelous cockatiel seed, was introduced to the writer on Saturday. He occupies a room in a modest little hotel on Chatham Street and is well known in that vicinity. In fact, he was vice president of a Republican campaign club in the 2nd Assembly District during the late political canvass. It was called the Independent Campaign Club and had 62 names on the roll. It was organized with a view to business, and a fair business was done. The vice president took an active part in the campaign and turned the most of his votes into the Tammany Hopper. The Honorable Emmanuel B. Hart might do well to summon him before the Anti-Tammany Investigating Committee, for to the writer's personal knowledge, he worked the Grady ticket for Assembly and was paid for his services. He numbers among his acquaintances Bell the Union Scout, Texas Jack, Buffalo Bill, and various other distinguished citizens. The Ranger told the story of his life. Barring probably occasional exaggerations, it bears an imprint of truth. At first, he strongly objected to its publication, but feeling the Sun's exposure had ruined his business, and that he could not consistently fill a recent score of orders for the wonderful seed, he cast aside all scruples. There seems to be a fine thread of conscience in the woof of his brain. For, said he, I never sold a seed to a poor man or woman. Only the wealthy and refined were taken in. They could stand it. My conversation and their experiences were well worth the money. They were the victims of their own folly. I never lied to them. All that I told them about the flower was true. It is the handsomest and sweetest smelling flower on the face of the earth. They jumped to the conclusion that the okra seed was the seed of the same flower, but I never told them so. Of course they inferred it from what I said, but that was their own business, not mine. I distinctly told them that if the seeds turned out like the cockatiel, and as they ought to turn out, they wouldn't take $25 for them, and they wouldn't. While in the government service 2 years ago, he took a few of the original seeds to Washington and presented them to distinguished people. After they were all gone, scores of first-class ladies and gentlemen importuned him for more. When he lost his place and became dead broke for the broken promises of government officials, he tried to supply the demand and flattered himself that he had succeeded. At any rate, he soon found himself on the high road to fame and fortune. Comanche George says he was born in Grayson County, Texas, in a little place called Kentucky Town, a few miles from Sherman. All his schooling was packed in between the age of 10 and 14. He went to a private school in San Antonio, and my old playground, said he, was the Alamo, where Travis Fannin and Davy Crockett were butchered. The war between the North and South broke out when he was 14. He joined Captain Moore's company of the 8th Texas Rangers, Colonel Terry commanding. It was understood that they were the originals who were with Sam Houston in 1836 and with Zach Taylor in Mexico. They were sent to the Western Army under Bragg. Terry was killed at Mumfordsville, Kentucky, in the retreat to Nashville, when Buell was following us down, and a better man never breathed the breath of life, continued Comanche George. He was succeeded by Colonel Jack Warden, not the renegade Jack Warden now in New Orleans, he added with sudden energy, while his eyes snapped fire, but a pure-blooded Southern gentleman. During the war, he got leave of absence and went back home. There he got into a row with a Mexican at a fandango, and was killed in a duel a few hours afterward. Colonel Tom Harrison followed Warren in command. He was wounded at Fayetteville and made a brigadier general. I took him his commission, and though badly wounded in the leg, rode 96 miles through the swamps and turpentine farms in North Carolina to give it to him. The ranger here drew up the leg of his pantaloons and showed the scar. It was just below the knee pan, and had evidently been a formidable wound. For an hour he entertained the listener with stories of the war. Probably the most interesting was the account of his reception by General Grant at Fort Donelson. When the gunboat came up the Tennessee River, he said, and Grant landed below and took Fort Henry, our regiment was with General Forrest in Fort Donelson. I was orderly of Company C. Floyd and Buckner proposed to surrender, but old Forrest said he would be damned if they could surrender his troopers, for he would cut his way out if he couldn't get out in any other way. We got away the night before the surrender, in as heavy a rainstorm as I ever saw. While I was riding along, one of the boys told me that my cousin Charlie had lost both his legs by a shot from a gunboat a few hours before. This was the first time I had heard of it. I thought the world of Charlie, and I turned my horse around and rode right back. Before daylight, I struck a Yankee picket and surrendered. I told him my story and rode on within the lines. I found Charlie and knew he had to die as soon as I saw him. I nursed him all day, and he died at 4 o'clock that evening. The Yankees were mighty kind and wanted to help bury him, but I wouldn't have it. I dug his grave and buried him with my own hands, and struck a pine pole at the head of the grave, but I reckon it rotted away long ago. The sad memory seemed to choke the ranger, but after a moment's hesitation he continued. The next day, somebody fired a gun near headquarters and stampeded 25 or 30 head of horses. Away they tore, with General Grant's black horse at the head of them. My little mare Bessie was lariated to a tree, with a lasso in the saddle. I jumped on her back, lassoed Grant's black horse inside of 100 yards, and brought him back. An orderly wanted to take him away from me, but I said I would only deliver him to Grant personally. Grant then came on, and I said, "Here's your horse, sir. I could have easily got away with him, but you've all been so kind to me here that I thought it wouldn't be right." He asked me my name and command. Probably the 8th Texas Rangers, I told him, for by God, I was proud of that name and am yet. He told me to call at his quarters at 10 o'clock the next morning, and I did so. He returned my horse, pistol, Spencer rifle, and gave me 3 days' rations and a pass through the lines, telling me that if I was ever a prisoner again and wanted a friend to call on him. I joined my command, was with them at Shiloh, Stone River, and all the other battles, and never saw Grant again until I met him in Washington 2 years ago. Comanche George says he was thrice wounded, in the shoulder and the leg, and lost the forefinger of his left hand. At the close of the war, he went back to Texas. For a long time, he was a herder for a man named C.H. Wilson in San Saba County. Wilson owned about 50,000 head of cattle. There were several Indians in the 8th Texas Rangers, and the trapper says that he saw many others while herding on the plains. A young man, he easily acquired their dialect and could converse fluently with the Comanches, Utes, and Kiowas. He says the Apaches and Shoshones speak the same language, though the dialect is different. One day he heard that they wanted scouts and interpreters up at Fort Sill. He thought it would just suit him, and applied to General Mitchell, then in command. But he continued, Mitchell had chums of his own that he wanted to get in, and gave me the cold shoulder. I asked him to send my application to General Grant in Washington, and tell him that his old friend George Anderson, the Texas Ranger of Fort Donelson, asked for the place as a personal favor. If he didn't do it, I would write to Grant myself, and knew that I would get what I wanted. So Mitchell sent on the application, and the answer was, give George Anderson what he wants, U.S. Grant, verbatim. For many years afterward, Comanche George spent his time in the saddle, scouting, trapping, fighting Indians, and interpreting. He says he was with Professor Hayden up in the Dalles, and instanced many other distinguished men who were glad to secure his services. Over 2 years ago, the Apaches, Comanches, and Utes wanted to send a delegation to Washington to see the Great Father about an extension of their reservations. And right down there, said the ranger impressively, that I claim to be the only white man that ever came to Washington with a Comanche Indian and pronounced Indian with a J. The Estacado Llanos, or Staked Plains, and other spots in Texas and New Mexico contain some fertile land filled with game, and the Indians wanted to secure them. I went to Washington with the delegation, said the ranger, as they're to pick Anahuacoa click to Wanala Peach, or the white medicine man who talks all. We stopped at the Washington Hotel, kept by Ben Broadridge in January 1876. All the Indians stopped there. The government won't allow them to put up at any other hotel. Somebody must get a nice steak out of it. The Indians were in full feather. I was dressed in a fancy buckskin rig, and of course we attracted a good deal of attention. Here, Comanche George told a story that will especially interest all religious people and lovers of morality. He says that they had hardly arrived in Washington before they were inundated with theater tickets. All the managers were anxious to secure the presence of the Indians, with the hope of drawing big houses. Among them was one Rogers, who ran a variety show called the Theater Comique, a sort of black crook show, something like Jack Barry's Columbia Opera House. As the trapper puts it, an ounce mini ball would outweigh all the clothes worn by any one of the girls. He says he told Rogers that nearly all the Indians were young braves, and he thought it would produce a bad effect to take them to such an entertainment. When they returned to their homes, they would take back a disgraceful story concerning the manners and customs of the whites. He begged Rogers to abandon the idea. The latter, however, persisted. He said that they would draw a big house, and he wanted them to come. If their interpreter refused to bring them, he would see the Reverend E.P. Smith about it. The Reverend Mr. Smith was then Indian Commissioner. Sure enough, the next day, he received a peremptory order to take the Indians to the theater Comanche. I went up to see Mr. Smith, said Comanche George, and protested. I told him that it was not the desire of the old chiefs to have their young men visit such places. Smith replied, "You are here under my orders, and I order you to go there." There were some Seminoles in the city at the same time. They came from their reservation on the Arkansas line. He brigaded them with our party and bade me have all the Indians in full costume and appear at Rogers Theater that evening. Colonel Boudinot and Colonel Adair of the Cherokee Nation were in Washington then. I don't know as they said anything officially, but in private conversation, they expressed their indignation in the strongest terms. We went to the theater and were slapped in the front seats, where the Indians had an uninterrupted view of all the indecencies of the ballet. They gazed at it with open eyes, and well they might, for I have never seen anything in New York or New Orleans that would beat it. The house was packed, and Rogers, and I reckon Smith, made a good thing out of it. The next day, the Indians visited the president. A great many congressmen and others were present, but the trapper could only call to mind Senators Bayard and Frelinghuysen, Secretaries Fisk and Chandler, the Reverend E.P. Smith, General Debrell of Tennessee, and Congressman Key, now Postmaster General. As we entered the room, said the ranger, Grant sat at the end of a long table, smoking a cigar, with one foot on the table. He recognized me at once, for I had seen him a day or two before. He introduced me to those present, and I introduced the Indians to him. He shook hands with them all. The mutual introductions ended. He said, "After this little walk, you must feel a little dry. Won't you take something?" I had noticed the door ajar as I entered, and supposed that it led to a sort of cloakroom. The president threw it open, disclosing what you might call a neat little bar, without a barkeeper. He asked us all to drink. I took whiskey straight, and so did Grant. Many others followed suit. All the Indians drank but Clamtuscana, chief of the Comanches. He was 6 feet high, about 65 years old, but straight as an arrow, and had long white hair that hung below his belt. When urged to drink, he uttered a scornful negative, and turned his back so that he could not see the young braves pour down the detestable firewater. For some minutes he stood motionless, looking out the window. Grant touched glasses with all the Indians. I showed him the Texas tip, said Comanche George, and explained how it was done. Touch the top of the glass first, then the bottom, and then hit it in the middle. After drinks all around, the president closed the door of the little bar and resumed his seat. He then asked the savages why it was that they could not become civilized like their white brethren. "You see," said he, "how we live in this country. We have big railroads, big steamboats, and big iron horses, big churches with big steeples, and big war chiefs with big heads. It all comes from civilization. Why don't your braves take a lesson from us and do as we do? Why do your young braves get filled with firewater and rob and scalp your white brethren on the plains? Why do you not become Christians and live in love and peace with all men?" Such was the purport of the president's speech. Then Clamtuscana straightened himself. "It would have done your heart good to have seen him," said the ranger. His eyes were like the eyes of an eagle. He first stared at Grant, and then at the senators and cabinet. "The great father of the country," he said, "asks us why we are not civilized, and why his red brother does not follow the ways of the whites. He asks us why we drink the firewater and do many wicked things. The great father has been with the red man on the plains. Did he ever see his red brother make the firewater? Do they ever see it except when they get it from the white trader? It is like the apple of the prickly pear. It smells and tastes good, but it bites the tongue and crazes the man who takes it. And you, the great father, who ought to set a good example, have urged my young braves before my eyes today to drink the firewater. They have received it at your hands, and you have drank from the same bottle. Is this your boasted civilization?" pointing to the closed bar. Suddenly he turned and pointed to the Reverend Commissioner Smith. "And last night," he continued in a thrilling tone, "this man, one of your spiritual medicine men, made my young braves and myself go where my whitened head was bowed in shame. We saw your prettiest squaws before us, without blankets or covering, nothing but beads. We saw them kick up their heels like fawns, and leer and smile, while more shameless men roared and applauded. Is this your boasted civilization? If the daughters of the red men had done this in the land of the setting sun, our braves would have cut them to pieces and left their bones to bleach on the prairies." Raising both hands to the ceiling, while his long gray hair streamed down his back, he exclaimed, "Blessings on the Great Spirit, he has not civilized his poor red worshippers." If a streak of lightning had gone through the room, said Comanche George, those present could not have been more astonished. Senator Bayard clasped the old chief's hand in silence. The president made no response. His face did not flush, but was as impassive as ever. There was one reporter present, but Clamtuscana's real speech never appeared in print. The speech, however, did not close the interview. It lasted some time. Grant gave each of the Indians an overcoat before they left. During the interview, Mrs. Grant and Mrs. Fish appeared at the side door. The president, continued the trapper, introduced me to Mrs. Grant, who introduced me to Mrs. Fish. While talking with them, I felt some cockatiel seeds in the pocket of my buckskin suit and presented them to Mrs. Grant. I described the flowers, and the ladies were much pleased. Mrs. Grant gave me a silk scarf in return. I gave Mrs. Fish free seeds, all I had left. She wanted more and told me if I ever came back to Washington to bring her some and she would give me a nice present. I reckon she is now the only one in New York who has now the genuine seed. While the Indians were in Washington, Comanche George says he met his old friend Professor Hayden, who introduced him to Professors Bayard and Henry of the Smithsonian Institution. At their request, he took the Indians down there. The scientific men bought some pipes from the red men and made them several presents. George gave Professor Henry free Apache scalps and declares that they are now in the Department of Indian Curiosities with his name attached. I had 2 more, he said, good ones too. Both were sun-dried, and one of them had both ears on. Firewater Jim stole them and pawned them for $1.50 apiece. They were hanging for months in the windows of a pawn shop on Pennsylvania Avenue, and for all I know, are there yet. The ranger's description of a scene with the Indians in Bell's photographic gallery was amusing. They were afraid of the camera and would not stand in front of it unless the scout was at their side. So my picture, he said, was taken with each Indian, and you could see it in all shapes and sizes in the government gallery. I gave one to my friend Professor Hayden. At Mrs. Grant's reception, Comanche George called upon the Reverend Dr. Newman, who lives, as he expresses it, in a snug brownstone front near the Metropolitan Church. The doctor had heard of him, was glad to see him, and talked to him a long time. The conversation finally turned on religious matters, and George declares that the doctor urged him to seek salvation and join his church. Mr. Newman told him that a life on the frontier was full of peril. He was liable to be killed at any moment, and his soul lost forever. I answered, says the trapper, that I believed in God and feared him. If the Lord wanted anything out of me and would manifest it in an unmistakable way, as he did to Paul and Samuel and Peter and those other fellows in the Bible, I would try and do the same as they did. Until this was done, I had concluded to hump along in my own way. But Mr. Newman, I said, if you should hear of my being killed on the plains, I should be glad to have you pray for my soul. He said it would be too late then, and I left him. The next Sunday night, at the doctor's request, he took all the Indians down to the church. There was a great crowd, and the red men took front seats. Old Clamtuscana shook his head, and the eyes of the young braves began to glisten. When the doctor appeared instead of the ballet girls, their disappointment was great. 3 of them, Capitalist, Strong-Armed Jim, and the old chief, were fast asleep, all for the sermon, and the others were willing to be. At the close of the services, said George, the doctor looked me right in the eyes and asked all those who wanted prayers to stand up. To oblige him, I got up, and about 25 of them prayed for me. Such is an outline of what the ranger calls some of his personal public experiences. His story of his downfall in public life and adventures while selling cockatiel seed is even more interesting. The limits of this article, however, forbid its narration today. This story came from the great state of Indiana, being reported in The People of December 15th, 1877. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.